Welcome to Upstream. I'm Shane Morris, back now from paternity leave. I'm joined again by my producer and product manager, Wayne Stender. And Wayne, I know you know a lot about big families. You have twice the number of children that I do. And so I've very much benefited from your sort of advice and encouragement in this phase of expansion and stretching for my resources and ability to just keep up with all these kids.
Yeah, there's no magic bullet, but there is just encouragement. And you have to have courage every morning when you wake up to be a parent. And, just having twice the number of kids doesn't mean that I know how to do it better. It just means that we just do stupid things faster in my house. It's like having caffeine. So we're having a lot of fun with our 8 kids right now because it's summer here in Minnesota. When it's summer in Minnesota, it's like I told you a couple weeks ago, it's like the calves come out in the springtime and they start frolicking and jumping around, and it's insane. And that's what we're doing right now. We're just running in all directions and it's so much fun. But I love the stage that you're in, the baby stage, when you're waking up and you're exhausted and, all the things you don't remember, half the things that you're supposed to remember because your brain's not working right. And it's just, I think that that's kind of a fun stage a little bit to do with your spouse. And I don't know why I think it's fun. My wife would be like, yeah, you do think it's fun and you're crazy for it, but you just need to jump into it with both feet and just own it. You're a whole different person when this process is done. So
it is a good thing. And this recent episode made me think a lot about the difficulty of engaging in what we traditionally think of as leisure with a bunch of little kids. It's not only kind of a brain drain at times, you feel like you can't concentrate on your work, but you also feel like you don't have any time to just unwind and relax. And when you do, you tend to just gravitate toward the TV or something that's not super productive, constructive, or edifying to your person. And so that's a struggle you have to deal with. But Dale, who's a good friend of mine and has read a lot about the subject, really challenged my thinking on exactly what leisure is, because we tend to think of it as this time to recharge our batteries and veg out so that we can be better at our hard work later. But he challenged me to think of leisure in an older, more theologically and philosophically informed way as enjoying and contemplating the wonder of life for its own sake. And that includes, enjoying things like even the act of being a parent, enjoying your kids for their own sake. That as hard as that work and effort can be, part of the reward is what people in older times would have classified as leisure. So I know you've got some questions coming out of that, and I don't know if I have many answers, but I can sort of continue the conversation that I think Dale and I were having, because it's something that I'm thinking about continually now as I strive to not be exhausted.
Yeah, I think we're running into, the people that are listening to this are going to hear 2 tired dads say, this is what we would do if we could relax. But I thought that it was a really interesting conversation, partly because for me, my idea of leisure and my idea of rest, there's a little bit of that moment where I want to go into my backyard and I want to stare at the tree and just go into my nothing box, because I've been in a box all day long. And then, so there's that idea, I think, of like rest, or like allowing my brain to rest and maybe to rewire or to heal from all of the work and energy and things of that nature that have gone on during the day. That it's not a tension headache, but I just feel like there's tension up here at the 4 of my mind and 4 of my forehead. And I just need to stare at a tree for like hours and contemplate nothing. But then there's this idea I felt of what you guys talked about with leisure that actually ends up being something that's active, that it's not just something where you're not necessarily resting, but it's something that you're also building in. Am I misunderstanding where you guys were bringing that? Because for me, leisure means I'm not going to think deeply about many things right now. Like, I don't have the capacity to sit and read a book on leisure. To me, reading a book on leisure feels non-leisureless. So, because I'm not resting, right? So can you explain that for me a little bit? I sense that there's a difference between leisure and rest. Is there a difference between the two? And what should we do as Christian men, especially, who are pushing it all? I feel like many, and like there's moms on this, and there's, business, working class, or working women in this podcast too that listen to this, that, we come to this place of maybe needing rest. But is leisure and rest, are they the same thing? Are they synonymous? What are your thoughts there after talking to Dale?
Yeah, reading a book about leisure sounds a little bit like planning for romance in your marriage. It's just we equate leisure so much with rest and lack of effort and lack of thoughtfulness, mental exercise, just like we equate romance with spontaneity. So it seems like a contradiction in terms to be doing that sort of thing. But all of the really good relationship coaches and counselors will tell you that you do have to plan for romance if you want to sustain that sort of thing long term in your relationship. And the same thing, I think, is true in an analogous way with leisure, that you actually have to learn and think in order to exercise it correctly or to enjoy it correctly. As far as I understand Dale's point and Pieper's point and the other authors that he cites, it sounds to me like leisure and rest are different things, but they do have a significant adjacence or overlap, where rest can be a leisurely experience. I think that you can have true classical leisure in rest because you are enjoying something, let's say sleep, or a time out in the forest, or a walk with your family, or a day at the beach, in and of itself, for its own sake, not in an instrumental or utilitarian way. But at the same time, that rest does have a utilitarian purpose. It is to, recoup you physically and mentally for what comes later. So nothing about that conversation, I think, should be heard as denying the usefulness of rest and the fact that leisure can encompass restfulness and even sleep, like a nap. But that's not the sum total. I think the point is that thoughtful leisure needs to encompass much more than just charging your batteries up for the next big workday. It has to encompass a deep exercise of contemplation and wonder that acknowledges the gift and grace of all you've been given, and then celebrates life and people and possessions and places and experiences just for their own sake, as an end in and of themselves. So you come together. The clearest example to me is like a feast, and the Bible uses this very, very much like that. Leisure sounds a bit like celebration to me, although there can be leisure that's centered on almost like a fear or awe, as he talked about. But the experience of coming together to celebrate, say with family or friends over a meal, at no point during that experience do you say, well, what use is this? It answers itself. The question answers itself. That is the point. Being there with your loved ones is the point of that experience. There is no further utility that you're seeking to wring out of it. Not to say it doesn't give you additional things, but that's not the point. When I think of the theological analogy for this, my mind goes back to the Westminster Confession, or not the Confession, the Standards as a whole, and the Catechism, which says that the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. And John Piper, in his book Desiring God, which is a real famous title, sort of modifies this a little bit in order to unpack the meaning. He says that he proposes we understand it more as man's chief end is to glorify God by enjoying Him forever. He says we should connect the two clauses and say that, or the two parts of the sentence, and say that the means by which we actually glorify God is to enjoy Him, because God is an end in and of Himself. And therefore, if we follow our greatest joy, our greatest intrinsic longings, we will find God at the end of that journey, because He is the fulfillment. He's the rest that our restless hearts seek, as Augustine would say. And I like that concept. I think it's very useful. I had Joe Rigney on the podcast a long while back, and he's written a couple of books very much working out this idea of Piper's, and I think in a theologically careful way that avoids some of the potential, pitfalls or accusations that Piper faced of being, a consequentialist or something in his ethics because he said pursue pleasure. No, his whole point is that God is our highest pleasure, and we're just made for Him. That in the end, the point I'm trying to make is when you think of life as centered on leisure in a meaningful way, and that worship itself can be encompassed in that, it makes a lot more sense. And you realize what all the work is really for. Well, yes, it's to glorify God, but we glorify God because he is our chief joy. And all the other joys that we have are derivative or received from him. And we enjoy them as well for their own sake because of the fact they're gifts. And that sounds like, to me, what a big part of what the experience of leisure encompasses. Now there's more, and I'm speaking as someone who's only had some conversations on this, not done deep reading, but it sounds, you know how when you hear an idea and it really fits nicely like a puzzle piece with existing thoughts or understanding that you had prior to that, that's kind of how this concept of leisure that Dale introduced to me fits within my prior understanding of things.
Yeah, so that brings me to my next question, because I felt like, and I really believe that maybe I've been resting wrong. Like I have one job in my life, right? Like when I come home, I should rest. And I feel like, man, I've even been doing that wrong sometimes, because when I hear you talk about what leisure is, and then I look at what the Bible says that God does on the seventh day, and then the command inside of, Exodus to work for 7 or 6 days and then the seventh rest, that I wrestle with that, because I wonder if my concept of rest previous to your conversation was that for 6 days we toil and we labor and we create and we build. And then on the seventh day, we just kind of like we lay in the hammock and we just let our bodies recuperate. And I get the impression that actually what I should be conceptualizing that rest to be, what God does, might actually be a little bit more of what leisure is. That rather than resting for the sake of maybe recuperation, or even to just stop working, that leisure has a little bit more, and maybe that idea of rest inside of Scripture has a little bit more of an active component that I never thought of it to have. What do you think about that concept? Am I misunderstanding what the Bible talks about when it says that God rested on the seventh day, and that command for us to do the same?
It sounds to me like the command to rest, rooted in God's own rest at the end of the creation week, encompasses leisure. That there's a recognition of what he has done and an appraisal that takes place. You'll hear, systematic theologians when they write about it, or even just commentators on the text, they'll say that what God is doing here is not taking a nap so he can recover, because God doesn't need to recover. So what's he doing? Well, he's setting a pattern for us, but I also think he's doing something in and of himself that is, desirable in his being, which is taking stock and making an appraisal of his work. So he does a little mini appraisal at the end of each movement of creation, but then he takes stock of the whole picture at the end and says, this is a very good thing that I have done. And in that, he sets a pattern, but he also appraises for himself. And you understand that in a Trinitarian way, and you realize, oh, okay, there's glory being given from person to person in that act of appraisal and rest, where each person of the Trinity is getting the due credit for the work done in and through and for, and so forth, to use like Paul's prepositions there. So there's a great mystery to God's rest, but I think that his rest is extremely purposeful, especially since he doesn't need rest in the utilitarian sense. The purpose is found in the rest itself, though, in the appraisal that's taking place. And that sounds to me like it ought to be a clue to how our rest and leisure function, that when we are done working, we step back and we appreciate the fruits of our labor for what they are, that we appreciate the fruits of others' labor for what they are. We thank God for them, for the ability to bring them into existence and to work for his glory and the good of others. And then we, rest to prepare for our next cycle of work. And of course, the worship of God's people, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, is centered on this day of rest. So there's the Sabbath day is a holy, set apart day in the Old Testament for the remembrance of not only what God did in creation, but what he's done in history. And it's that continual repeated cycle where the faith is reaffirmed. There's a deep Hebrew theology of the Sabbath that pops up again and again throughout the Old Testament, and then is taken up into the Christian, what Christians have called the Christian Sabbath, although it's never called that in the New Testament, the Lord's Day, Sunday, when Christ rose from the dead. And that becomes the center of our worship. And a big part of our worship is, I always used to be confused as a kid. It was like, Sunday's supposed to be a day of rest, but going to church is a lot of work. I see how stressed out mom and dad are when piling all the kids into the van and getting them to church and all. This is not there's some yelling sometimes, there's some discipline that has to take place. This is a challenging day in many respects. And now I appreciate that much more deeply and profoundly as a parent. Yes, it is a challenging day just to get kids to sit down and be quiet in church. But nevertheless, the rest that takes place there is a spiritual, intentional rest that I think is, again, overlaps a lot with leisure, because we are coming to that time of worship to acknowledge the God who is responsible for all of our good things, and who makes our work possible and who gives it meaning. And that is the ultimate moment of awe. That's the ultimate moment of appreciation of something in and of itself for its own sake. We appreciate God for his own sake. We are filled with wonder and we celebrate him. And there's even, remember I talked about a celebration over a meal. Well, guess what we do at church? We celebrate over a meal. And, traditionally many Christian groups have done that weekly. My particular denomination will do it monthly. Typically, there are some who do it weekly, but that's a celebration of Christ's work, and it's not in order that we can achieve something else. I think in the final analysis, that celebration is a foretaste of the wedding feast of the Lamb, which is the ultimate celebration, the ultimate act of leisure for its own sake. Now, maybe I'm stretching the concept too much, but I see a lot of connections here that I think Dale would be in agreement with. And it sounds like the authors that he's citing are gesturing in this direction as well. The importance of having this discussion and of talking about leisure as something more than just physical recuperation for the next work week is that our modern world has construed rest in exactly that way. And it's led us to do two things. First of all, we undervalue the time that we get that we call leisure. And then the second thing is we misuse it. We actually, because it becomes unimportant for us, other than just as a veg out, it gives us permission to use it on frivolous things. And I don't think Dale, he even said in the podcast, I don't think he's against what we call frivolous things, right? Watching a TV show, kind of turning that sensation of turning your brain off a little bit. I'm going to actually talk with our colleague Casey. We're going to talk about movies, like summer movies and so forth, and how to approach that as Christians, but the themes in those movies and the whole experience of, watching something that's, in final analysis, probably fairly dumb. Like, what is the value? How is that excusable? And I think that's very similar to the question that Dale is asking. How is that valuable or excusable? I think he does say it is excusable, but in moderation. It's like a sort of a candy. Something much more profound has to be happening when we set out to experience leisure. When we, for me, leisure is nature. They're almost equivalent. And when I get out in the natural world, either with my kids or by myself, because they can't go underwater with me yet.
Well, they can. It's just not healthy to do it, right?
Yeah, it's not healthy for them. Yeah, it's true. They need to learn some important skills first. When I do that, I'm never, ever doing that in order to just sort of mentally recuperate. It's not actually easy what I do a lot of times. It actually involves a fair amount of work and huffing and puffing, in exercise. I do it because there's a deep aspect of like celebration in it. When I take my kids out to a more remote place and I show them the trees and I show them the sky and I show them the animals that we see, we take pictures of them, and I encourage them to celebrate those things in the moment as wonderful. And we're not, at no point are we thinking, hey, today we saw a deer and a possum and 3 alligators. That means that we will be better suited to work this coming week and to achieve some very measurable goal. It doesn't help you in that way. Unless you have a very specific job, I imagine, unless you're like a wildlife photographer and that's how you earn your paycheck. But other than that, it doesn't help you. So why are you doing it? Well, because these things are wonderful and you want to celebrate them for their own sake because God made them. And that's part of the essence of leisure. They are wonderful. And you, as a creature built for wonder, go and experience wonder intentionally. And that's a pure form of what I think Dale is talking about with leisure.
Yeah, thanks, Shane. This is a great conversation. It was fun to just think through a little bit of even how I find myself doing rest, what rest is for. I've often thought that rest is just a place for us to be doing nothing, and to just finding ourselves in a place of leisure is actually just something that's completely self-centered or self-focused. And this conversation really challenged that for me. So I really appreciate you taking the time to do this and go upstream with us a little bit here and continue this walk and this march in life of all the things that we're doing, whether it's in work, but especially in leisure. So as we enter in to this weekend and the summer, this is a good conversation to think through. So thanks for this, and thanks for listening to Upstream and following us as we further explore what it looks like to be Christian in this moment, and then also to live as a Christian in this moment in the way that God has designed us for, and to image God in all the things, even leisure. So hope you have a great weekend.